on SRHE's annual conference. And as you can see, the message is popping up reminding you that the meeting is being recorded, as will all of the sessions that you are attending throughout today's virtual conference. My name is Dr. Claire Laughlin-Chow, and I'm the CEO of the Society for Research into Higher Education. I've been in post for a year now, getting to know the Society, its staff, policies, processes, and publications, and meeting with council and network members, as well as getting to grips with issues important to the Society's activities and development and working on our strategy for the next 5 years. I'm very much looking forward to this year's SRHE conference, as I'm sure you are as well. Our theme is very interesting and timely: higher education research, practice, and policy, connections and complexities. Over the next few days, we'll be exploring the various challenges and rewards involved in academic policy engagement. We'll address questions arising from the different paces and scales of research versus policy development, and investigate ways in which research and policy can be embedded into mechanisms of scrutiny and evaluation. We'll also be looking at any potential drawbacks to forging closer links between academia and policy, and the various views about what constitutes an acceptable evidence base. Can we maintain research integrity and support curiosity whilst also responding to policy issues? These questions will be engaging with colleagues from all over the globe with diverse viewpoints, offering useful perspectives on our own experiences. We're all very pleased at the Society that we've been able to retain the hard-won advantages of an online forum for discussion of these issues in our virtual conference space. It's really pleasing to see so many of you here online taking advantage of the increased accessibility that this format affords. We're also delighted, however, to be able to respond to our members' feedback calling for a return to an in-person conference, with 3 days of in-person engagement in Birmingham scheduled later in the week, and we hope to see some of you there. In both formats, we have thought-provoking plenaries scheduled, along with interesting paper groupings, discussions, symposia, network sessions, and a poster gallery. I particularly encourage you to explore the SRHE special interest networks, because these represent such interesting fora for discussion and presentation of new research. I'm also delighted to announce the theme for next year's blended format conference in December 2024. Next year's conference will be entitled Higher Education, a Place for Activism and Resistance. Higher education has always had a role in engaging with society's wicked issues, with academics being drawn, sometimes unwittingly, into politically charged discussions about a wide variety of issues, including climate change, the impact of austerity policies, medical ethics, resource scarcity, or even the economics of Brexit, just to name a few. Borderline between activism and dialogue is, however, a contested one, and it gives rise to a number of concerns. The 2024 conference will explore the ways in which staff and students are, and have historically been, involved in various forms of activism, and ask questions about the future roles that higher education and the people within it might take. But returning to this year's discussions, I'm eager to learn as much as possible from colleagues over the course of the week and to engage on important topics within research and policy engagement. And I'm also hoping to meet with as many members as possible throughout the conference. Please do contact me virtually or grab me in Birmingham with any feedback or ideas that you might have either about the conference or about the Society's activities and priorities more generally. Anyway, I'm wishing you all a productive and fulfilling conference experience. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Pauline Neal, the Society's Chair of Governing Council, who would also like to welcome you and who will be introducing our plenary speaker.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire. And welcome to absolutely everybody. It's absolutely fantastic to be able to open conference again this year, and to know that we've got a really, really interesting week with so many different papers, so many different examples of research experience, a huge depth of knowledge coming our way. One of the great challenges of this conference is always to decide what to do and where to go and which papers to listen to. So I'm just going to mention that a little bit, because I particularly want to welcome to this conference our postgraduate and new members, and those who are new to the Society generally. Quite a big group of you, both online at the moment and then coming in the next few days to Birmingham. One of the really important things about conferences is to forget that you're going to give a paper yourself. You know that, you know all about that. It's very rare at a conference, in my experience, that more than one or two people will tell you anything that you didn't already know. The great thing about conferences is sorting out what you want to learn from them, what you're going to take from them, and which sessions you're going to attend in order that you actually learn. Because conferences at the end of the day are the CPD for academics. It's academic CPD, and that's what it's all about. So one of the things I just wanted to remind those of you who are really new to conference, and those of you who've been around for a while know this very well, it's plotting what you think you want to know about now that's going to be useful in 3 to 5 years' time. Because when you go to a conference and you come across a really interesting piece of academic practice in terms of teaching or academic learning styles, academic delivery, you really can't do much about it in the university in the next few months, because you've already got agendas, you've already got programs, and you've already got next year's teaching planned and sorted out. So it's the things you're going to go and listen to that you can actually think, right, actually that's going to work for me in 2 or 3 years' time. This is an area I want to follow up. This is something I want to do with my students. This is something I want to do in my research practice. This is a technique that could be really, really useful, and have time to let it mull over and then bring it into your practice a couple of years down the line. It's always a case of looking forward at conference and thinking, right, I need to go and find those people whose names I recognize from the papers that I've been reading about, but also look for those techniques and practices and research approaches which mesh with the things you're thinking about, or possibly don't actually mesh at all. I think some of my best conference experiences were at big conferences where, when I was very young and I didn't know who I was going to see or who was there or what it was about, but you found techniques which you would never have come around about in the normal run of your practice, which you can then bring into your practice, and that's quite innovative. So I would encourage especially younger members to really go and have a look at a good variety of different styles and types of paper and really enjoy the conference. And in between times, you'll give your own paper and have a really brilliant time. I need to thank at this point all the members of the team. When you come to Birmingham, you will find 2 new faces managing conference. For those of you who've been before for face-to-face conferences, we have Rihanna and we have Mariam, who will be with us this year, doing all the organising, which is brilliant. They've been with us for less than a year, and Claire, of course, who's been with us now just for a year and is getting her feet under the table and doing a brilliant job as the new CEO. The board, the committees and the board are as active as ever on your behalf in organising all the journals. Rob Cuthbert does a fabulous job in chairing and running the committee that looks after all the publications. And we have Camille, who looks after the research and development committee, which looks after the individual conferences, the individual workshops, and most importantly, helps sort out all the awards that we give for research. And this year we've had the usual excellent applications for research awards. So thank you to everybody who applied. Thank you to everybody who helped to review those as well. And I'm sorry we can't actually give rather more more awards to you, but do keep applying. There's some really excellent ideas come through. And even if it doesn't get through with us, maybe you can use that application in your own university or somewhere else for funding. This year, what was also new in the Society is we started to make some awards to people who've given long service to the Society, which has been absolutely fabulous. We had a really jolly AGM with quite a few of the recipients there to get their certificates back in November. So we have people who are now the award holders for actually being practically massively good supporters of the Society over, in one case, 25, 30, nearly 30 years. So it was a real pleasure to be able to congratulate people and thank them for everything they've done for the Society. One of the things that we'll be doing at Birmingham is trying to encourage people to really have a look at the different research groups and the activities going on, looking for more people to get involved with the having the experience of running the Society. So we're always looking for people who want to get more involved and help out with a process that really makes this an excellent society for all of us. So I'm now going to turn to our keynote speaker, Professor Dame Nicola Dandridge, who I hope is sitting somewhere in the SRHE office. Yes, Nicola, hello. Great, brilliant, she's there. This is always good to know. I always felt very confident at conference once I knew I got my key speakers. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dame Nicola to open our conference. Many of you actually will have come across her in all sorts of arenas. Many of you will be aware of her huge impact on the higher education scene through her work, first of all as CEO of the Equality Challenge Unit, and then as Chief Executive of Universities UK in what was a particularly challenging era, I think, as that middle period of the 2010s. And then, most importantly, as the first Chief Executive of the Office for Students. So from both sides of the fence, advocating for universities and for students, it's not really a fence, we're all a team against somebody else. She's got tremendous experience, so we were absolutely delighted to ask her to come and speak on creating effective connections between higher education research and educational policy and practice as the major theme for our conference. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Pauline, and thank you very much to the SRHE for inviting me to talk about this issue, which is so important, an issue I've lived and breathed effectively for the last 20 years. And I think it's an area where, at least in the UK, and particularly I think in England, we could do better in certain respects, but it's not straightforward. And I want to explore some of those areas with you today. And I do appreciate that this is an issue that SRHE has considered on several occasions, and many of you would have thought deeply about it and maybe done work in this area. So my intention is to talk no more than for about 30 minutes maximum, actually, and to allow time for comments and questions. I'm not entirely sure how that will work, but let's digitally, but anyway, let's give it a go. So the theme has a particular relevance and resonance to me, given that, as Pauline says, for most of my working life, I've been working in higher education policy at national level and have regularly found myself at the ECU, at UUK, and indeed at Office for Students, looking for relevant higher education research in the areas that I've been working on, and have often struggled to find it. And I'm now on the other side of you're quite right, Pauline, it's not a divide, we're all on the same team, but sometimes it feels a bit like a divide. But anyway, I'm now working as a professor of practice at the University of Bristol. And I think that has given me a much better feel for what the substantial barriers are to effective engagement with national policy. And in many ways, how distant higher education policy development feels from the day-to-day reality of university activity. So what I want to explore this morning is where this distance occurs, why it matters, where perhaps it's not only inevitable, but a good thing, but where it isn't, and what we could perhaps do about it. And approaching this issue, I'm going to separate out the national political agenda, capital P political, where higher education research may or may not be able to input into political agendas, and then national policy agendas that's not directly political. So, for example, working with the national agencies or with the Department for Education in England. And then, most importantly, in some respects, at institutional level, at the level of the sector, and how we can do more maybe to link research to university practices. And actually looking at those three categories, they all raise rather similar issues, but play out in a slightly different ways. I should say, I'm conscious that we have a fantastically international audience here, and I'm going to be speaking primarily from my experience in UK higher education, particularly actually English higher education, because that's where my experience lies. But I hope some of these issues will have relevance to other countries. I'm sure it will, but it'd be good to hear more about that. And I'm going to be speaking also primarily from uniquely actually from a policy perspective on the basis of my previous experience. And as Pauline said, I started in the Equality Challenge Unit, which is the UK sector, was the UK sector agency that was set up to promote equality and diversity, primarily for staff, but also in some respects students too. And I then moved to Universities UK as the chief executive, which is the membership body for universities in the UK, as the name suggests, and then the Office for Students, the regulator in England. And it's on that basis I'm going to be speaking rather than any academic basis. So let's start with politics. I'm going to attempt now to share my screen to run through some slides. So just bear with me while I get that set up. There we go. I'm assuming that unless anyone sends me a message, you can all see that. So those are the levels of connections I've just been referring to. So political level, DFE, national policy level, impact within institutions. And then I'm going to finish by exploring how we can perhaps make better connections, and why and when does this matter, because I don't think it always does or should.
Sorry, Nicola, we can't see the screen. Apologies, we can't see the screen.
Okay, yeah, I've just asked our Nomad IT tech if they can sort out the permissions to screen share. Winnie, can we get on that?
It's not the end of the world if we can't.
We'll work on that as we go, if that's okay. Sorry.
No, that's no problem at all.
Well, we're just pausing. I've asked people to put questions for you, Nicola, in the chat, which I'll keep an eye on. So if people have got questions for Nicola at the end, just to help with the Q&A at the end.
I'm going to have one last go at sharing it.
Yep.
Has that worked?
Hold on. Yes, you're there.
Very good. Right, that's what I was referring to. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to start with the first one about linking at political level. And I think in some respects this is the hardest. And as I've said, I think we shouldn't spend too much time on this, particularly not now in the UK, because we're just about to face a general election. So higher education, I mean, interestingly, in the UK has become very political. I think that's partly because tuition fees were so explosive politically back in the 2010s, but also some of the issues that have been pulled out have demonstrated clear blue water and distinctions between the political parties. And I think that has exacerbated the politicization, a point I want to come back to, because I think that is a very strong reason why we need more higher education research. But anyway, that's where we are. We have a political environment, and I've just illustrated how distorting this can be, with on the left the crackdown on rip-off university degrees. Too many universities are sold a false dream, a strong message coming out of the Conservatives. Now, interestingly, I mean, there is data that underpins this. This is not a headline that's plucked out of nothing. And what it's referring to is the data on non-continuation students who drop out. And also it refers to the graduate outcomes data on students getting graduate jobs. But the way it's translated, it's not mediated through academic research. This is data straight into politics, and some would say straight into ideological politics as well. And I think that lack of mediation is illustrative of why we get, I think, very crude political headlines. I'm not making any party political points here. So we have Labour on the right-hand side, reviewing the whole landscape of tertiary education. And I'm just quoting here from a speech that Matt Weston gave, who's our shadow higher education minister, I think last week, who, and I'm just quoting here, Labour will review, in his words, Labour will review the way that the whole landscape of tertiary education works, how the lifelong learning entitlement can provide opportunity to further on higher education systems, that high quality learning should be accessible to everyone at whatever stage of life in a variety of forms. I mean, I think my observation about that is, how could you possibly not disagree with that? It is generalities in the extreme. And I think we're not getting any sense of substantive policy engagement, which academic research, for example, can engage with. So I think we've got both sides of the fence there, not making it easy for engagement with academics. We have, though, seen some academics having their research used by the political parties. Certainly during the course of the tuition fee debates, there was quite a lot of work, academic work, that was drawn on, but interestingly, mainly from economists, and some legal work as well has been drawn on by academics. And I think what we see is that it's not necessarily higher education research that's relied on, it's those other disciplines which inform policy in this area. And then, of course, separate to that, we have quite a few higher education folk being appointed to chair workshops and so on, but and not workshops, working groups. But I think what we see there is they're being appointed in their role as, sort of, say, vice chancellor, rather than as because of their academic discipline. And in any event, most working groups tend to be headed up not by the sector, but, for example, the Brown Review. John Brown was an industrialist, and then we subsequently in England had the Philip Auger review of sustainable funding, and Philip is a financier and a writer and journalist. And actually in Scotland, I was just reading the James Withers report on skills, and he likewise is not from the higher education sector in Scotland. He is an industrialist too. So however you look at it, I think at national political level, the impact of higher education research is marginal. I was reflecting whether the position is different in terms of regional politics, where there's much more constructive engagement generally between universities and regional political groupings and parties. But I think mainly the engagement is through higher education research in terms of industry or economics or whatever it is, rather than educational research. So I'm not sure that actually at regional level the picture is very different. Anyway, where I think there are stronger links is at the level of national policy. So this is not political, this is the DFE, this is sector agencies. And here I think we have seen some very useful invocation of academic research. And interestingly, I think in my experience anyway, that's primarily focused on areas of social mobility and access and participation, where in the UK generally, I think, and probably elsewhere globally too, there's much more of a sustained policy commitment to addressing social mobility and access that isn't so subject to the vagaries of political parties. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's a momentum that's been allowed to build up, where the timescale for academic research hasn't necessarily been an obstruction, because it transcends the shifting politics of party politics. But outside widening participation and equality and diversity, I think it's harder actually even here to identify areas where higher education research has had a substantive impact on higher education development. I think where we've seen it a bit more was in the agencies rather than in the DFE, the Department for Education. And so, for example, Advanced HE, QAA, the OFS's TEF, Teaching Excellence Framework panels, have all drawn in academics. So it is happening. but I think more at the level of higher education agencies than at a departmental or national policy level. So why is this? Well, I've identified some reasons why I think this is. Firstly, I mean, it's just a question of the substance, the focus of academic research and the focus of policy tending to look at different things. And what I've attached there is a picture. The right-hand picture is the areas of research interest. So these were set up subsequent to the Paul Nurse review of the research councils, and the idea was to try and encourage government to engage with academic research. So it extended beyond just education into all the government departments. And the DFE drafted their areas of research interest as a way of inviting research and also potentially funding it in certain areas. But if you look at what the areas are, they are overwhelmingly focused on schools, and where it touches on higher education and further education, it's very much to do, well, it's tilting towards further education, tilting towards skills, and tilting, I think, towards economic analysis. So I won't read it out, but it's interesting to read that. And I think it doesn't suggest that at departmental level, the sort of areas that they're interested in are necessarily the ones that we read about in the peer-reviewed journals. And it was interesting, actually, when I left the OFS to join the University of Bristol, I was discussing exactly this issue with the DFE, and they said they're really keen, and it'd be great if I could do some work on well, not me particularly, but generally on lifelong learning and the lifelong loan entitlement, because that's such a priority for the moment. And I was thinking about this, and I think it's really important agenda, but actually that's not what I'm interested in. I'm really interested in the relationship between teaching and research and how that plays out in national policy agendas. And that's what I've been looking at. But that's not at all of any interest to the DFE. I mean, exactly the opposite in some respects. And so I think that disjuncture in terms of substantive areas of interest is one of the disincentives. And actually, on lifelong learning, it's quite interesting that some of you may have seen a report put out by Public First last week, which was polling on the potential take-up and interest in lifelong learning, and very relevant in terms of policy. But that came from a think tank. It didn't come from the sector. And again, the polling data wasn't, so far as I'm aware, mediated by any academic research. It was just, here is the data, and these are the policy implications. Another illustration of this is if you look at the Research Excellence Framework impact case studies, which illustrate how research, as the name suggests, has impact in policy in other areas. And I was just looking at the education ones. I mean, I was skimming this. This is not there's no rigor to this process, but there are 230 case studies in the education unit of assessment. And from my very quick reading, about 23 of these related to higher education. All the rest were schools or early years or other non-higher education related areas. And of those 23, the majority were about widening participation or access, or on very granular and specific issues. And there was, I can confidently say, very little linkage into the DFE's areas of research interest, or indeed of national policy. So I think there is a challenge there. I've also emphasized capacity, because I think there is a real issue in terms of DFE capacity to engage in policy development. I think it's significant that the areas of research interest are dated May 2018, so they're already quite old, whereas we see in other government departments they've been updated and they feel very sort of vibrant, real documents. This has a slight feeling of being slightly out of date, maybe reflecting the fact that DFE is not inviting in any serious extent research engagement in their areas of focus. The third bullet point here, approach. I mean, leaving aside questions of capacity and substance, perhaps more significantly is that at a theoretical level, I mean, I'm preaching to people who know far more about this than me, so I will be brief. But I mean, research has a different cadence to policy development. It works at a different speed, a much slower speed. dependent on funding already slows things down very considerably, tends to be retrospective, tends to be much more theoretical and granular, whereas policy is forward-looking, generalist and practical. And the second image is a book by Michael Barber, who is an educationalist. He started as a teacher. He ran the Prime Minister's delivery unit under Tony Blair, and then he became chair of the Office for Students, is where I came to know him very well. And he writes about this distinction between research and policy development. And I'm going to very quickly read you the relevant bits, because I think he's speaking from such authority here. He says, evidence-based policymaking, this is page 7, by the way, evidence-based policymaking, while obviously a good thing on the face of it, plays into the case for caution, because by definition, the evidence relates to the past and often recounts numerous failures. And then he goes on to quote Dr. Zhivago, which I'll skip. And by definition too, the research is never complete and cannot tell you whether an innovation will succeed or not. And he develops that theme later on, actually, on page 130. He says this is not an argument against large-scale academic evaluations. He's talking more about evaluations here, which take place after the event. If done well, such research can and should be of huge value. And insights like this are vital to building the evidence for future policy, but they are of limited value in real time at the point of the decision, and so on and so forth. So I think he's just saying, look, we'd like to, but it just doesn't work. And I think that's one of the challenges in this area. Incentives are also not aligned. There is not necessarily any funding for policy development, not in the way that there is for academic research anyway, that's got a more theoretical bent. The policy papers may not be returnable, and they may not be obviously capable of publication in standard peer review publications. So all the financial incentives, the publication incentives that are so important from an academic perspective simply don't work for some of these policy papers. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that some universities have established centres of policy engagement, and they're really useful, but they are often contingent on funding coming from the university. And I'm aware of several excellent units that have actually just stopped their work, or it's been mainstreamed into other areas because the funding has dried up, given the financial pressures. Then academic integrity, I think, is an issue here. If you are working towards national policy objectives, then there are questions about whether or not you can retain your integrity in terms of reaching the conclusions that you think are relevant, but government or other national policy folk may think are not. And there's always a risk of your research being cherry-picked by politicians, which then distorts the meaning. And I think that means that, well, I've spoken to some academics who are really wary of going down this route for exactly that reason. And then finally, I think a fundamental antipathy, particularly at the moment, particularly in England, on both sides, political and national policy, and also the sector, in the sense that many academic papers that I read are highly critical of government, which it disincentivizes government from engaging. And likewise, some of the policies of government are antipathetic to academics, which again is a bit of a disincentive. So I think we have all number of challenges here, and I'm going to come back to some of them, but I want to move on now to institutional level impact. So this is within universities, academics having impact on practice within universities, and also to some extent collectively at sector level, independently of national policy or political activities. And I mean, it's impossible to generalize here because there's individual practice within universities that's hugely different, and in any event all of you will be far closer to this than I am from within your universities. But from what I've observed is that there is very little linkage between higher education research and university practice. And I mean, there are definitely pockets, but I think it hits up against all the barriers that I was just identifying previously in terms of national policy engagement. The incentives just don't work. The money is not necessarily there. The time isn't there. It's not returnable. And ultimately, if one's engaging with one's university, it's looking inwards, whereas all the incentives in terms of career development look outwards towards national policy or international policy platforms. So I think the incentives aren't there, disincentivize. But, and I want to come back to this, I think this is the area where there is huge potential for substantial impact. And I think I would like to discuss what we can do to try and improve those links. So bringing all this together, why, first of all, does this matter and where does it matter? Well, I think it undoubtedly would improve the quality of policy development, at whatever level you're looking at, if it was more underpinned by academic research and analysis. And I mean, lifelong learning is rather a good example. The public first polling that I mentioned suggests that there might not be much demand for lifelong learning, even though this is a flagship policy. And you can't help feeling that if that rigorous academic research had been done before the policy was launched, it might be more nuanced and it might set it off an important agenda on a better footing. I mean, there is some research, but it hasn't been foregrounded, particularly in the work in this area. Another rather obvious, highly contentious example is free speech, where there is, in my view, some evidence of challenges around free speech on university campuses. But where is the extensive, compelling research being relied on to demonstrate that, for example, the legislation, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 that's just been passed, where is the evidence that demonstrates that that piece of legislation is the answer to the problem? Where is the evidence that demonstrates that the provisions in the legislation about academic freedom, so different to free speech, but academic freedom, is under threat, and that the legislation will provide the answers to those threats? There is some evidence and there is some academic research, but it's not necessarily tied to the particular proposals in this legislation. And it's hard not to think that if there were more robust research evidence-based, then the legislation would look slightly different. And then a more personal example was during the passage of the Higher Education and Research Bill, when I was running Universities UK, it was proposed that the regulation, funding and oversight of higher education be split between research and education, as indeed happened with UKRI and the Office for Students. And there was concern in the sector about this. And I remember we were trying to put together a briefing paper on what the consequences of splitting the two would be. And I spent a long time trying to look for that research, and I failed to find it. Now I'm looking into it at Bristol, and I can see that there is some evidence and research, but it's fairly fragmented, it's difficult to access, and it's not really focused on the national policy consequences of splitting the regulation, funding and oversight of the two. So the brief that we prepared was policy orientated, but it lacked academic research, and I think was much weaker as a consequence. And now we are, of course, where we are with the two split. I also think it matters, second bullet point here, because it will depoliticize some of these issues. The fact that there's lack of evidence, I think, and the lack of research means that we're much more in the realm of ideology and politics, whereas higher education is far too important, I think, to be driven entirely by that. And I do think in many areas we would get much better policy if there was more input from academics. And also, final bullet point here is the sustainability of these policies. If they're driven by politics, then they're going to be overturned by the next government. Whereas if we can establish a consensus about the relevant evidence, then that can transcend politics. So I think for those three reasons, there is a very strong case in terms of doing more. But I put a bit of Shakespeare here. This is Julius Caesar because actually this is just such a boring slide. I thought it would be good to have a bit of Shakespeare. Men at sometimes are masters of fate. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves. So the point is, can we do something here rather than being reactive in terms of political agendas to try and proactively shape some of these policy agendas? And I do appreciate, as I've said before, that the incentives are against us. So this needs focus and effort. So how can we do this? Well, this is my final slide. Several reflections here. I think the substance matters. And what I mean by this is that I think we need to pick the areas very closely and try and anticipate relevant policy. There are areas which might be responding to immediate challenges within higher education, but the timescale, higher education policy, but the timescale is not going to allow for research to underpin it. So I think not necessarily now, because we're in the run up to a general election, but certainly in the UK and in England, I think a strong case could be made for discussing with the DFE how and where more useful links can be established, and the areas of research interest that I mentioned before, how they could be updated in a way that anticipates future developments. So I think that's a national discussion that needs to be had with the sector, and maybe SRHE can play a really important role there. But I think it needs to be focused and measured and anticipate future policy developments rather than react to them, because otherwise the timescales are just not going to work. Coordination with other bodies, I think this is really important too, because there are many other bodies involved in this space, and we do need to work with them. This is not just the higher education bodies that are focused on policy development, but Institute of Government, for example, and that's the image that I've attached to the slide. This is a 2022 report, Better Policy Making. They say, and this is the quote, departments should take greater responsibility for ensuring they can access the research they need, including by funding research and working more closely with academics. Now, clearly, this is across the whole areas of government. It's not just education or higher education, but I think IOG and others within the civil service are really keen to see better engagement. So I think there are bodies there who could be collaborators and partners, and we would be pushing at an open door to engage with them. And I think going back to the question of the substance of any engagement, I think we need to be realistic that they're not going to be looking necessarily for theoretical analyses, but the really important areas are what works in terms of policy, what works in terms of evaluation. So I think the discussion is likely to be focused in those sort of areas. And I think we also need to foreground the disincentives. There is a real challenge about funding not being available when funding is so tight, and a real challenge about the fact that these areas won't necessarily promote the traditional academic careers. And I think anticipating them, discussing them, and being explicit rather than addressing them reactively and realizing that retrospectively there were barriers is a challenge. And I think we need to think more about communications as well. If you are working in policy, you don't read academic research publications. In fact, you can't even get to them. I remember when I was at the OFS in the UK, this was a real issue, because you don't have access to an academic library so that you can read this sort of stuff. And what you do read is think tank circulars. You read HEPI and Wonky and those sorts of circulars, but you don't read academic research papers. So I think we need to foreground and anticipate how we can make sure that we communicate more effectively. But then my final reflection is the importance of an autonomous sector. I think more important than everything is we need to think about how we ourselves can construct the sort of policy environment which works independently of government and to some extent independently of national policy developments. I think as a sector, we have a tendency to look to government to define our work and our mission, as opposed to taking responsibility for defining it ourselves. And this actually, when I was at UK, I remember criticism for the sector of the various UK government's green papers and white papers that led to the Higher Education Research Act and the Teaching Excellence Framework and so on. The criticism was there is no vision in there from the government of higher education. And I think that's probably true. But I was thinking, well, thank heavens for that, because it means the sector can develop its own vision and be true to its mission and independence. So I think it is within our gift to come together to construct compelling policy at national and institutional level that focuses on relevant policy issues such as teaching quality, things that, you know, very close to all our hearts, teaching excellence framework, how do you incentivize teaching quality, how do you incentivize student outcomes, all those sorts of things that are really, we know are really important, regardless of national policy and regardless of politics, and do more to inform the policy of development in this area. We need to work, as I said, with partners, and I do think organisations like Advanced HE, QAA, UK have a real role to play, but we need to recognise that they're membership organisations. They're answering to a slightly different trade body type agenda. So I think this is the role for academics to come together and try and inform that agenda. And but we do need to lean into the work of those sector bodies. So acknowledging the difficulties, acknowledging the disincentives, I do think that there is a very strong case for being proactive in shaping the policy agenda rather than reactively letting it being shaped by others. And we need to make sure that we are all inputting and doing it independently of government where that's appropriate, rather than waiting for any invitation. So I am going to stop at that point, and we have a few minutes, I think. And Pauline, I don't know how you want to take questions or comments. I don't necessarily want to speak anymore, but I'd love to hear what people think.
Okay, thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm going to ask people who want to comment to actually just turn their screens on, so we've got a better chance of seeing you, because I've got 6 screens worth of people here. So Claire and I will try and spot you waving at us. Claire, can you look across as well, see if you can see people? I'll just start by saying there's so many things you said, Nicola, that resonate with me, of which the phrase "not returnable" is something that probably dominated the whole strands of us through our careers and thinking about where to go next. Because we do have huge numbers of very well trained and experienced researchers, and we spend a lot of time in SRHE discussions talking about how we can better influence policy. Alexander, I can see, Alexander, you wanted to tell people you've got a session to follow up on this. Over, Alexander, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk, Nicola. Really, really interesting, really valuable. I was wondering, just on that connection, about how higher education kind of data can be utilised more, because it strikes me, as somebody who was a senior lecturer and is now the graduate outcomes manager, I now have access to data that I never did as a researcher and as an academic, and I'm aware there's a huge amount of wealth of data, both within at a provider level, but also at HESO and JISC level, that actually, if they join those up, we could get some really valuable insights. And as it is, I feel researchers are stuck out in the cold. They want the data, but unless they get funding, they won't get access to the HESO JISC data. And I feel like there needs to be something that we do to really open up that data, to allow us to learn from it, to allow us to improve educational policy and practice. And as it happens, I feel like there's a real big kind of opportunity missed there. People who have access to data, often administrators or people who perhaps don't have the incentives nor the time or the skills to be able to actually look at the data in the ways we might want to.
Thank you. Can
I just say, Pauline, I so agree with that. It's a really powerful point. And it's baffling how data is just not more. I mean, there are obviously data protection issues, but I think it's a very powerfully made point. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to speak, but I didn't want to say I totally agree.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, Rob Cuthbert's got a comment here, which I've also written down. So, Rob, I'll just cover it for both of us. There has to be a way that the University of Bristol or Oxford or Cambridge or London can actually give access to government people like yourself so that you can read this literature. There has to be a way that eventually it could be sorted out if somebody could be bothered. You might have a go at your Vice-Chancellor, my old Vice-Chancellor too.
Can I just say on that, I mean, we can all pitch up at the British Library, which is what I used to do, but it's just not it's not
Yeah.
immediately obvious. But yeah, thank you, Rob.
You have
Agree.
to do it from your machine at home, don't you? Colin McCaig, Colin, are you handy and able to make your point? If Colin doesn't come in immediately, I'll read out. So Colin is saying that for those people going to Aston, he's got a session on Thursday afternoon, 3 till 4, which is going to introduce and talk about Nicola's. It's an open forum for discussing what Nicola's just been talking about. So those of you who have, oh, there you are, Colin.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I'd forgotten I put that in. Sorry. Yeah, that's a session that's on the main conference agenda. Hopefully it'll be an annual thing that we'll do within SRHE, which will showcase or provide an opportunity for anyone to raise policy related issues, partly because a lot of the research at SRHE is obviously reflective of what's gone on before, but whereas in the world of policy there are always upcoming things, so it'd be a good opportunity to raise any issues that people are thinking about. And so we invited Smita to come along, talk about potential changes to how the regulator works. For example, if there's a change of government, or even there isn't a change of government, issues have got to be dealt with anyway. So if you're free, come along for that 1 hour session, and hope to see you there.
Great, thanks for that, Colin. I'm just going to pass over to Ella Taylor-Smith in Edinburgh. Ella, I can see you're on.
Thanks, Pauline. Yeah, we were at had a policy impact event last week, and one of the researchers from our governments said that ideological governments were less interested in research. And I wondered how that related to what Nicola was telling us, especially given that it was very sort of Westminster focused. And I think it'd be really interesting to see throughout the conference how people relate to their different governments. Obviously, you know, that with so many people from all over the world and all over the different parts of the UK, they might have quite a different experience about governments being more or less open to research or more or less fixated on a culture war.
Thanks, Ella. Nicola?
Can I just comment on that, Pauline? Because I mean, I think one of the things that we've got happening in England at the moment is that the policy is dominated by a belief that higher education is a market, where the questions of policy have a slightly different flavour, because they're not higher education policy that is developed, for example, in government and then translates through, as was HEFCE, into the universities. So I think that concept of centrally delivered policy is quite alien to the politics in the UK, which is one of the reasons why I think in the legislation setting up the OFS there wasn't a vision for higher education, because the vision is students have tuition fees and they choose, and their choices define what higher education looks like. And I think that I'm on the board of the University of Glasgow, so I have really good and interesting insights into what's happening in Scotland, and it feels very different in Scotland, where there's much more sense of a centrally driven policy approach to higher education. So my sense is it's less to do with ideology and more to do with what the politics are, and whether or not it's a politics of a free market or whether or not it's a politics of a more centrally driven higher education world. And I think that is a distinction between Scotland and England.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Nicola. Given that it's now 5:02, I am going to close questions at this point, but huge thanks to Nicola for joining us and taking the time to come and join us today. It's a fascinating area. I'm looking forward to a number of people capturing us on later in the week, asking to set up a lifelong learning agenda research group, and to a whole suite of papers about that in conference in 3 years' time. It is really interesting at the start of your career, going back to talking to people who are new in this business, actually looking to see where these gaps are, the things that haven't been worked to death, that haven't been done to death in the literature and research in the last 50 years, finding these things which are new and relevant to policy and have the potential for making a real distance in the long run. So Thank you so much, Nicola, for your time. Thank you for coming and talking about this. Really look forward to seeing an ever increasing amount of higher education research going into the REF. It's been a long, slow fight since that period when higher education research just wasn't even considered back in the early years. At least now you've got 23 cases in there. It's you know, it's been a very long and difficult road to get this far. So thanks everybody. We are starting again at 10 o'clock with the first round of sessions. I will see people in session 1.6 there in a minute. Have a great day and enjoy yourselves. Get to as many sessions as you can. Thank you very much, everybody.